Okay, so I recorded a video like this before that wasn't so great. I'm going to push this actually into multiple videos. This first one's going to be primarily focused on the SSS shader and some of the issues with it, some things you can do with it. And then the following ones will be more about creating the maps and putting them together. So let's first create something simple. So the first thing, of course, about the skin shader is that it's scale dependent. Uh, Usually when you start up Maya and you've got it set up, it's usually in centimeters. So if you want to start dealing with sort of real world scale, right now this one unit item is basically 1 centimeter. So if I want to go ahead and make an eyeball, let's say, then I'm looking at about 2.5 centimeters for an eyeball. So there's, an eyeball size. And of course, eyeball related to an actual head, it would be significantly larger. So dealing with something in sort of real world scale is going to help you get better results from the shader. Now, I'm just going to set up a simple light here. Just go ahead and create a light. How about nice little area light? Did I not pick an area light? Create lights. Area light. There we go. And put that in there. Do a quick test render. Mental ray. And there we have it. Very good, Lambert. Being illuminated. So let's get the shader on there. Assign new material. Mental ray. And the one we're going to be primarily focused with is the MISSS Fast Skin Maya. So to do this, it asks you if you would like to create a new light map. So the first thing to say about this is that when you haven't created a light map, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and set it up. This is an automated system that previously, when this shader first came along, you had to put together manually, and it's somewhat of a lost art. Now you don't necessarily have to really know about all that stuff, but we're going to poke a little bit at it. What this light map is and what it's doing. So first of all, go ahead and create a new. However, do not create a new one for every single shader that you use. Try and reuse the same light map because each one will take more time. And the thing is that a light map is actually set to render screen space. If you notice when it comes up, the mental ray texture that's actually hooked into the light map, the thing that's baking out the information, is got a resolution, an actual resolution, which is based on your actual render settings. So right now it's 1280 by 640, and that's 1280 because my width of my render size currently is 640 by 480. So typically a light map should be double the width and the same height as your render settings. So this has got an expression in it, that's why it's purple, which is basically doing that automatically. Automatically, as soon as you change the render settings, will make it double the width and at least the same height. Information about this as well that you should be aware of is that it's currently using the default input profile. You have the options of making sure that it's linear, or if you want to deal with sRGB, things that you can play with regards to linear workflow. Filter size. Your filter and filter size are a way of sort of softening the result, I guess, a little bit. However, I don't think it's really that visible. I have played with it a couple of times. I don't really use it all the time. I had to remember what it was. So filter size basically just softens the overall written map. It's kind of like anti-aliasing, I guess, but I tend not to use it. Writable basically means that it's rewriting it every time you click render. It rewrites this information. You can turn this off if you set it to local. This is if you're using something like an image on a render farm. It's supposed to work that way. And you can turn off writable, and of course that depends on you actually providing a name. So if I were to go ahead and put backspace, which is very important, and call it whatever I want, then it will save into my current project. Now, I've noticed with 2012 and 2013, when I've been playing with this, that changing this to write out the light map, if I try and change any of the colors on the shader, Maya will basically exit. So be aware that that can happen. So this does speed up render. I did a simple render that ended up taking about 6 seconds, and writing it just from the baked out map, turning off writable and just using that, basically like a final gather map, took 2 seconds. So it does cut time off your overall render. However, without the ability to actually change and alter the settings, it basically becomes kind of useless. So until that that goes away, you can try it out if you want, but it's happened that way for 2 of my computers, so it's there. So that's what that is. And of course 32 bits, you want high color depth because you want all the information. If you were to use something lower than that, you wouldn't get very much information and it would be essentially useless. So that's the mental ray texture. That's what that thing is. So what else have we got attached to it? Well, we've got our light map. So let's go into Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade. Actually, this is a funny thing, is if you create them individually, they show up in your utilities, but when you create them this way, they don't actually show up in your utilities, which is kind of strange. I'm just going to go ahead and graph this, and it's going to show up these guys, and I'll graph that, and I'll be able to see, press A, my fast light map going on there. It's just like that, That's plugged into my light linker. So here we get the shading group, and of course the shading group under mental ray is important. You'll notice that the light map is plugged into light map shader, and you'll notice that there is no shadow shader, which means if you want to use this particular shader in passes, if you try and do a shadow pass, it doesn't actually show up. Isn't that neat? That's just wonderful. So often cases you need to plug in something else to get shadows from, and I could try and plug this Lambert in to get shadows off of it, and that would get me shadows. However, don't use any of the legacy shaders. With this, I found that I also got crashes that way as well. It's better off to use something like, let's say, an MIA shader. So if you want to render off passes, you could use the MIA Material X Passes and plug that into your shadow shader, and that would do well. Also, later on in this video, we're going to actually plug this into an MIA shader, which will take care of some of that, but however, we'll have to plug the light map in there. So we'll talk a bit more about passes in a moment. Then we have our light map, and so we have it writing out to the mental ray texture, and we've got some information here. The light linking can be set to custom, inclusive, exclusive, or just use the Maya light linking, which is internal. If you use light linking, then it should be set up to automatically do what you need it to do. So that shouldn't be a problem. So let's take a look at this initial render first before I start poking with stuff. So here's our initial render. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And right now I don't have final gathering on. If I include final gathering, then include indirect lighting must be on in order for you to be able to see that information affect this. So if I were to go ahead and let's say create a sort of exterior for final gathering, let's bring that up and up. I'm going to assign a new material to this. Let's just go with a regular Lambert. And I'm going to go ambient up and diffuse down, which means it's no longer affected by lighting. And I'll turn on Final Gather. Come on, you can do it. Final Gather. There we go. And we'll click Render. And if we take a look at that, you'll notice that, generally speaking, the lighting here hasn't been included. This has become less dark, that is true. However, don't mistake this for actually impacting the actual lighting on it. And you'll see the difference. We'll go back to the shader, and let's store this one. Fast in, and sorry, light map, include indirect lighting. And we'll go ahead and render that off. And now you can see that the lighting has passed through it. So rather than being this dull gray that's slightly illuminated, now the light is actually passing through it. So really gray lost a lot of its information, and now it's got that skin color back in. So include indirect lighting, obviously pretty important. So turn this off temporarily. I'll get rid of my environment just by hiding it. Turn off Final Gather. And I'll just trash that. Now we're back to this. And we'll discuss this guy. So the diffuse gamma curve. So the diffuse gamma curve is parallel and perpendicular lighting information, how it scatters through this, this volume. It's essentially controlling the fall off through here. So if I go ahead, and it's currently 0.75, I'll set it to say 0.1. And you'll see that the fall off happens over a much shorter range. If I set it to something like 5, you see that it falls off right here, and it takes much longer. It's kind of a longer gradient, and all that's left is essentially the specularity from the original shader. So this is basically controlling that. So if you do want to change that on an overall scale with not necessarily changing the internal values, the subsurface scattering elements, like its amount of red or yellow, like its front scatter, back scatter, etc., but you want to change it overall, well, you can control its overall scattering through this. So 0.75 is the default. You can go there. Its overall ambient color, you can see that it's including sort of false lighting. So it's kind of like putting a final gather kind of deal into it just through there. So it lightens up the darkness. So that's pretty straightforward. This is where it's writing out to the light map. So it gets the lighting information, and then it writes it out to the light map. So whatever we do here will go into that mental ray texture. And then we have the scatter bias. And the scatter bias basically is bias basically means that it pushes towards one or another kind of piece of information. So if I go into the negative values, you'll notice that it will push towards the backscatter information. So negative value will push you into the reds. If I had some more reds, that would make it pop a bit more. And if I go into a positive value, it's more towards the front scatter, so it gives more weight to that. So it's basically saying that if I want more backscatter or more front scatter, that I can control it this way. So you can push it a little bit forward to get more front scatter to control that if you like. 0 is the default. It's kind of halfway even between the two of them within the current settings. So these are essentially sort of overrides for all of that information. So far, so good. So we've got our texture information down. We've got this light map information down. What else can we learn about this overall shader? Well, let's go through some of the initial settings in here. So we go through the fast skin, and of course we have our ambient value, and much the same as I did before, it illuminates the overall thing. However, in this particular case, it doesn't push the overall subsurface scattering. It's not light passing through it, it's just taking the shadow color, whatever it is, and just making it brighter. So the current shadow color was black, so I'm getting kind of a grayish thing, and it's really adding white to the overall thing. So it's just adding what value this is. If I were to take this to a red color, for example, it would push all that stuff into the red, and you can get an interesting look off of that as well. So there are potential uses for it, but that's what you're going to get out of it. Your overall color is essentially an override. Overall color essentially says, go ahead and make it this color. So if you need to add makeup to your character, you know, some dark eyeshadow, or say some bright lipstick, you can go ahead and add it to this layer. White essentially says do whatever the skin shader is doing, but if you want something more than that, then you can go ahead and add some colors to this, and that will tweak that. A lot of times the overall color texture that's added to it is something very close to white with hints of color from the original painted texture. So the actual skin colors that you actually wanted to begin with, but not fully, because otherwise Windows just informing me that I'm apparently running low on memory. So overall color will override. So if you put the actual skin texture in there, like the actual skin color, basically what you're saying is, I don't care what happens underneath, I want this to be the dominant thing, and that's all I'm going to do. So that can actually lead to it looking less proper. So you want to keep this fairly close to white, otherwise you won't get that nice subtle effect. The diffuse color is also kind of an override in a sense. If I go ahead and take this and I set this to black, you'll actually notice that it will get darker. You can use the diffuse color to do darker skin. So if you wanted to do a black skin, then you could go ahead and darken this out, but you'll have to increase its overall weight, because the weight here is basically saying whatever this value is, only add that much of it. So only 0.3% of this will influence that. If I were to set this to a value of 1, it should impact it a lot heavier than that. Actually, you know what? The impact will be greater on the higher levels. You notice that before it was white, and 0.3 does that. It has less impact on the lower ranges. Now, that said, I can also push this into negative values. So let's say -1, for example, and I get more of a chocolate color. So you can influence the overall colors through this, and you can get this information when you go ahead and paint out a map, a diffuse map, let's say that's kind of like a grayish color. You can actually go into the map itself, and I'll do that in the other video, and you can actually make it go into negative values. So keeping the same range but going to the negative values, allowing you to do darker skin tones. So now that I'm in a negative value, let's see what happens. Let's go to a value of 1, and now you see now it actually impacts it. So if it's at a value of 0, it doesn't really change much, but when you go into negative or positive values, it does impact it fairly heavily. So we'll just take this guy back up to white and keep him at his 0.3, and we should be back to something fairly close. So it wasn't quite that. I think it's maybe down a little bit. Is that the case? Okay, so let's go down here to our epidermal scatter, subdermal scatter, and our back scatter. The names of these, when you're trying to plug this stuff in, is not the same as what you have in here. So when you're trying to plug stuff in via the hypershade or whatever, you're going to see this one listed as front, mid, and back. So that's essentially what it is. Light coming in from directly forward is going to get primarily this color. Light coming in presumably from, say, the side as well as front will gain some of this color. So this is kind of the top layer, what's underneath. And then of course this guy only shows when light is coming through from the back side. So as light is illuminating that back side, the non-visible side to the camera, it will get that. And I imagine it's reading that based on normal direction from the camera. So here's our backscatter information. Now, each one of these, of course, have a weight value assigned to them. So how much influence do they have on the overall final color? If I go ahead and set it to a value of 1, you'll note that more of that yellowish tinge tends to come through, and we can see that right there. Set this guy to a value of 1, and more of his orangey colors will start to come through, and we see more of that. And then, of course, backscatter set to 1. Well, there's not a lot of backwards light, but I'm seeing a very slight reddish hue coming through here just because the backside of it is illuminated. The next we have our epidermal scatter radius and the scatter radius here and over here. This is light supposedly passing along the surface, and this is using Maya units. Now currently this scatter radius, when light hits a point on the surface, is supposed to travel along the skin 8 centimeters, which is a pretty extreme amount considering that shouldn't be happening. And this thing is getting annoying. So you should be looking at something a lot more reasonable. Not even a full centimeter is actually fairly reasonable, maybe about half a centimeter, so 0.5, 0.6, somewhere around there should be something reasonable. Then we have our subdermal scatter radius, and again, same idea, passing along that surface. It is a thicker layer, so we could probably go a little bit higher, but probably not further than, say, 1.5. But again, this will depend on your overall initial scale. So we could go 1.5, 1, try out different things. See how far it feels natural, 1.5, and play around with that. Then we have this guy as well, and probably should match whatever that is, so 1.5, 1.25, somewhere in there. And then of course the depth is how far through the surface. Now for skin, the depth that it should be passing through should be a lot closer to, again, however thick you think an object should be in real world scale, let's say like 1 centimeter, for example, or 2 centimeters, to be able to have it pass through. So it's an important value. If I were to go ahead and say put it to, say, 2 centimeters, you'll notice that there's a subtle change, not a huge change, but there's a change all the same. And that's how far it can pass through. Specularity. So overall weight, how much specularity to actually include. And this set of information, we do have reflections in here, and there's an edge weight and other stuff in here. Since I've been playing with this, initially I tried to struggle with these guys and try and get something good off them. I will make a mention about this primary scatter color, which is a blue tint, and that's because it should be the inverse color of what your skin is. And by inverse color, it's basically the opposite end of the color wheel in your RGB color wheel, not a red, green, yellow color scale, which is a little bit different. So if you were to go into Photoshop and take a capture of this and then press Control-I, it will invert the values, and whatever color you get from that would be something similar to what you would want to put for this. And the reason for that is because skin has a tendency to desaturate when it gets into highlights. So as we get towards the actual highlight, we want to desaturate that highlight. And by using an inverse color, colors on the opposite end of the color wheel within the RGB scale, like within the light scale, will cancel each other out. They cancel out each other's saturation, so they become desaturated. So if you were to mix blue and yellow, in finger painting class, you're going to get green. But if you mix blue and yellow, they're opposite sides of the color wheel on the light scale, and together they create white. So that's the reasoning behind this. Opposite end of, like if you were doing green skin, you'd probably have a purplish sort of color for your specular map to get that same effect. Now it has two types of speculars. One is meant for oily skin and one is meant for drier skin. And we can control these in other ways. Again, I mentioned that we're going to plug it into the MIA X passes for more reasons than one. First of all, that you can use it for passes, and second of all, the way that it handles specularity can be actually quite a bit nicer. So we can control this same kind of thing through there. So a lot of times these days, people are not even using this. They're just going ahead, pressing 0, and then doing it within the MIA shader. However, if you do want to use it, again, it has a primary weight, so not just its color. If you want to dull it down, it's a good idea to go ahead and use the weight to dull it down as opposed to the color, because then you'd lose values. The way that these guys work is we're working with 256 values, so 0 to 256. And there's a distance between the three values. You have red, green, and blue. So let's just give kind of a visual on this. Duplicate you and you. And let's say in order to make this particular color, let's say I wanted to make it maybe a little bit of a green and a little bit of blue. And let's say this is how I wanted it to work. Well, if I go ahead and darken this, taking these values down, these guys are perhaps still in relation to each other, but they're not in relation to the red because the red is sort of at its lowest value already. So the distance between the red value and these other values has minimized, meaning that I'm losing their influence. So it's not primarily blue and primarily red anymore. It's now closer to even with all three values. And this is the nature of using a red, green, and blue. In this way, if I go ahead and take this guy and I pushed him to negative values, then I could maintain that distance and I would get a similar result to what I want. So this is why it's better to go ahead and use the actual weight values rather than just taking this and darkening it, where you're actually losing information. So that's why the weight exists. And shininess is just how blurry or focused the specular highlight is, so you can play with that. And then we have the edge weight, which I constantly forget what it does, but you can check that out in the help file. That is at least one thing that will show up for you. Or you can also play with it and render it off. Reflection weight, and then again it has its edge weight, and how blurry or not it is. And then we have telling it to reflect an environment only versus the other actual objects. So if you create something like an HDR, for example, it will render just that. Bump map is pretty straightforward. You plug it in, you get a bump map. Not much going on there. Light map, we see that it's plugged in here, and this is actually where we can control the samples now. Now, upping the samples will basically increase the overall quality. Of course, that will also increase render time. We talked previously about playing with the filter size. You increase the filter size, it can also smooth things out a little bit. But again, it will increase your render time. So anytime you want more quality, you're looking at more render time. So we could increase this up. It's a good idea to use computer-friendly numbers. So 64, 128, 256, 512, etc. Those are fairly friendly. You can bring them up small increments by all means, but sometimes it's best to go ahead and just double it up just to get to that level of quality that you need. So 128 would be sufficient. And then we have scale conversion. So I'm actually going to bump that back down to 64, just leave it as is, just to keep my render speed. And maybe I'll leave it like that. Scale conversion. So scale conversion basically is an overall offset for all of these values. We're basically changing how it relates to real world scale. If I go ahead and alter this value, I'm changing it from being 1 centimeter to say 1 foot or 1 millimeter or 1 micrometer as the software perceives it with regards to the light. So if I bring this down, I don't know, 0.1 and render that off, we'll see a subtle change, probably not a great big change right now. Let's just store that and go up to 10 perhaps. Yeah, you're not going to see a big change on this unless 0.5, what was that, 8, 4, 25, messing with that. So 10. So you see the change in quality suddenly. Not necessarily that it's passing too much more through, it is passing a little bit more, but a definite change in overall quality between those guys relating to its perception of scale. We'd also notice something with regards to backscatter, how much influence it would have or not if the light was behind there. Try a few different scenarios and you'll see that there will be a distinctive change in some situations. Not all situations, but some situations. Then we have fall off. Fall off, we should actually see a distinctive result. Let's go with, let's say 10. And there shouldn't be too much change here, but if I go ahead and change that to 0.1, I should see a result. And you see that it falls off that information. So the values don't go nearly as far. So the default is 2, which is actually fairly reasonable. It's not something that you're necessarily going to have to worry about, but that's it. It's there. So it's just another value that you can play with, and it just determines how much strength of that information goes through. And each one of these, you'll notice, will determine it in a slightly different way. So each time you play with each one, you get different sort of results. Find which ones you feel are the most appropriate for what you need, and then you can play with that. And that's just determining whether or not you're doing something like, I have the desire to make a grape versus an eyeball versus some teeth, etc. So the next guy here is, of course, screen composite. And screen composite basically says that it's adding the information together on top of the surface in a way that you would do, say, in Photoshop using a screen mode. So when you do a screen, it basically adds light values over top of each other. If I turn that off, it just does a regular add, which you note that I'm getting a bit more saturation off of it. Screen composite is typically recommended when you start using indirect lighting. So if you're using Final Gather, physical sun and sky, which also uses Final Gather, which is the whole point there. You want to include indirect lighting, and often cases you want to turn off the screen composite in order to get that better result. Otherwise, you can leave it as is, unless you like the richer color. It gets a little bit brighter, and it gets just a little bit more saturated. My light linking, again, we can keep that as is. When you're using hybrid texturing, you can choose what to view. So the overall color, and that should be in, say, viewport. Which is not working. I think this is just only if it actually has the color in there. Anyways, so that's what we're supposed to see, but we're not seeing anything, presumably because I have no texture plugged in, so there is no texture here. And I think that's been through the entire thing. So let's quickly set up an opportunity for some subsurface scattering to go into passes. So I'm just going to reset the scene. So as I'm going through this process, I'm just going to quickly talk about something. So I've got just the default light is being created in here. I've got some final gathering going on. And I'm going to create a sunlight, so to speak. And I'm going to do so not using a physical sun and sky, which is kind of the default idea. Like, let's use physical sun and sky because it's awesome. I'm going to create it my own way. So essentially the same setup, but with a bit more control over like environment and so on. So I'm going to create a light, and I'm going to create a spotlight. And that may seem a little bit weird at first, but I'll explain why as I'm doing this. I'm going to look through selected, and the spotlight, if I want to do things like caustics, let's create a quick locator and press F, so I'm pointing towards the center of the world. And this will replace the idea of using a sort of infinite light, directional light. Under here, spotlight shape. Selected, there's a camera. We're going to set your back up, back up, back up, and we'll take cone angle down. And what this is going to do is it's going to replicate the idea of that kind of light. Let's try 4. So the same kind of idea of the light by focusing it down so that the lines are close to parallel. And that's basically what the directional light does. I have no fall off on here, so it's essentially never going to fall off. It's never going to disappear over distance. But I have the ability to mimic some light, but I'm focusing all the rays within just that zone. So all the calculations for light is only happening within this region, rather than the directional light, which is essentially infinite. It will go through the entire environment, which is kind of a negative thing when you want to try and deal with stuff like global illumination, caustics, etc. It can go a bit crazy. So when you want to start emitting photons, especially if you're dealing with any kind of physical shaders, etc., which depend on photons to look correctly, you'll have issues. So this is a better solution. So in order to mimic that again, I'm going to just take this and I'm going to dump it into the locator. Now the locator can be used from this other view. Let's just go back to our perspective view to change the light angle. So I can rotate this guy, basically treating it like a directional light, the same kind of idea, and it'll always remain focused on this area, which is kind of cool. Okay, so let's go to that light, and I forgot to turn on shadows. So turn on shadows, and we can change the shadow radius if you want sort of softer shadows. We'll do that for you. Once you do that, you'll have to increase your shadow rays though, so that you get better quality. Just quickly render that off. And we have no shadows because my environment needs to have a few things changed on it, so I'll include that in the video as well. No casting of shadows, and not double-sided, which means I have to take this guy and flip his normals around. So reverse the normals, and I click render. And the reason why I make it not double-sided is, again, for the purposes of photons. Photons, even if it's set to be facing inwards and no shadows received or cast from the object, photons still will not pass through it. So by making it a single-sided object, it has no other side, which means photons cannot collide with it. So it will show up, it will contribute to the final gathering, it will provide a surface in which light, when it passes through, can bounce around within here, so it will do bounced light, etc. But light photons can pass through it initially. So there's our shadows. There's all that information. We'll go ahead and take all of this and go to the channel box, open that, go to render layers, create a render layer, and we go up to passes, create something like a beauty pass. That beauty pass. So essentially the initial render is essentially the same thing as a beauty pass. So it may seem a bit odd to create a beauty pass, but we didn't create it. Create and close. There we go. We're going to associate to that later. So this basically says when this renders, it should do that. And click render. Wonderful. And then we go check out that pass. So we want to do render pass, beauty. And looks pretty good. So let's now do this with a skin shader. So new material. Skin. We'll create the light map. Click render. Looks good. Let's load the beauty pass. Looks not so good. So no shadow, it doesn't show up, and now I'm frustrated because beauty pass should be essentially the same as this pass. And if I were to go ahead and add a shadow pass, well, it's pretty straightforward that it's not going to work, right? Because we just looked at that and we didn't have shadows. So let's go ahead and take a look at here we'll try raw shadow, create that one, and shadow pass, I'll create that one. And here, let's see, let's look at Specular, create one of those, and what other good stuff do we have? Reflection, we go create, and we'll just start associating these things. Let's close that. Great. Click render, get all these passes all at the same time. Let's check those guys out. Render pass, reflection, nothing. Perfect. Render pass, shadow, nothing. Raw shadow, nothing. Oh my god, so wonderful. Specular, nothing. So the problem is that this guy is basically, as he's set up, not ready for passes. He's just not going to be agreeable. So window rendering editors, hypershade, and that. And the problem is his shading group. So we go into the shading group, and he's just got the regular material shader, which is still not showing anything up, and he's got light map, and that's it. He's got nothing else to speak of. So I'm going to go into a shader, and I'm going to make the decision right now to go ahead. Well, actually, first we'll just, let's say for whatever reason you decided that you wanted to continue to use that shader. I'll go to the shading group, and we'll just dump him into the shadow. So just middle mouse button and drag. So I'll go ahead and render that. And get this. And incidentally, you could use this essentially as the beauty pass, basically what it's supposed to be anyways. But let's go with reflection. Still nothing. Beauty. You don't get the color, but you do get the shadow. Which means in the shadow passes, it shows up. Same with raw shadow. There we go. And still no specular, because it's not set up to do that stuff for that. So in order for any of that stuff to really go forward, you're going to have to add it to other shaders. Simple solution is to actually go ahead and plug this directly into this guy. So if I were to go down to advanced and drag and drop onto additional color, that adds it to it. couple things need to be changed to make it reasonable. First of all, I don't want the original diffuse color. And second of all, I don't need double the specularity, so I'm going to get rid of that. And of course, I have to apply it to that one. So I'm just going to right-click, assign to that shader. Just close this. Click Render. Assign material to should have reflections. There we go. That was weird. So I've got my reflections on here, I've got my skin shader going on, but it doesn't look quite right. Indirect lighting is not currently being calculated. I actually may not even have turned some of that stuff on. So let's go ahead and adjust some of that. Screen composite should be off. So that'll be a part of it. And light map should include indirect lighting. I click that. And you don't see much of a change going on there. The screen composite has changed something, but I'm not getting sort of the indirect lighting that I expected to see. So I need to affect that, and that comes from my MI material has no light map. So we're going to take the light map, middle mouse button, drag and drop, dump it there. And you notice that became more illuminated. And currently things are getting a little bit blasted out. You can probably just take that light and bring it down a bit. Just for the time being. So there we have it. And I've rendered off these passes. Let's go ahead and see what we get. So let's see reflection. There's my reflection pass. Beauty. There's my beauty pass. All that information is there. Nothing is lost. Shadow. There's my shadow. Shadow raw. There it is there as well. And specularity. And it's there. So this is essentially how you can ensure quickly that you get everything within your overall passes. So it's just a matter of going into the shader now for this object. And tweaking whatever values you want here, as well as going back to the there we are. Here in dealing with reflectivity, its glossiness, and you can control these things with maps, which again we'll talk about in the other video. So that will deal with most of your needs for passes, most of them. Now, one other thing that you can deal with regards to passes, as soon as you apply something to a pass, you also have the ability to go ahead and control any of these by right-clicking on them, and you can create a layer override. Layer override will change it to orange, and then when that layer itself renders out, you have control of these individual things. So if you wanted to break things down to epidermal, then subdermal, then backscatter, just individually, you can override these things on those layers and make one set to full, and then you can recomposite them back together in whatever compositing package. So that's, I think, the last thing that I need to talk about. Let me just check my notes for a moment. Yeah, and that turns out to be it. So again, when you use the MIA shader, remember to connect your light map, otherwise you won't get indirect lighting. Things will look like they're okay, but the indirect lighting will be lost, and you lose some of that light coming through there. So this is it. That's kind of all the stuff that I know about the skin shader at this point.